I'm Rajeev Dehejia. I'm an associate professor of public policy at the Wagner School. The central question that runs through my research is, what is the impact of government policy on individual behavior and well-being? There are two strands within that I have tried to tackle in my work. One of these is a methodological question. What methods or tools do you use for assessing the impact of government policies? And the second is just to evaluate particular policies in arenas like development economics or US domestic policy-based questions. One of the questions I've worked on is the problem of child labor. What, in fact, are the consequences of child labor? Is there any evidence that suggests that child labor is, in fact, harmful for those children that unfortunately have to participate in it? Now, again, isn't the answer to that obvious in some ways, that child labor must be harmful? Well, not necessarily, as it turns out, because in a developing country context, we know that many children have a very slack time constraint. So they may spend some time in school, they may or may not spend some time working, but a lot of their time is relatively unstructured. It's spent not in any particularly organized activity. And so in that context, you can certainly imagine that there's lots of time left over for them to be working, but also to be doing other things. And so maybe time spent working isn't going to harm their education, for example. Now, I'm an empiricist, so I'd like to say, well, all right, these are interesting perspectives. It could be one way, it could be the other, but what does the data tell us? And that's where, working with some co-authors of the World Bank, we've looked at data from Vietnam and Tanzania, and actually tried to ask, well, if we look at the data, does it tell us that child labor is harmful or not? So in both of those contexts, we had a data set or data sets in which we observed individuals when they were working, and we observed some individuals who didn't work as children, and we were able to compare them a number of years later. And what emerged from that was that, from both those sets of studies, was that, in fact, child labor does indeed turn out to be harmful for individuals that did it, even at fairly moderate degrees of intensity. Basically, they have less education as adults than they would have in the absence of that child labor experience. But interestingly, we actually find that there are some potential benefits to child labor as well. We find, for example, that children who worked seem to do better on what we as economists call the marriage market. So children that worked seem to marry better later in life. Particularly, we've studied girls, for example. This is a very small data set, but it's certainly an interesting result that girls who worked as children seem to marry at a later age, which is considered good. They seem to marry into families that have more assets. They even, in fact, seem to command a higher bride price, which is part of the tradition in Tanzania. So there's money that goes from the groom's family to the bride's family, and children, girls who worked, in fact, seem to command a higher bride price, suggesting that some of that experience they obtained when working as children may, in fact, be rewarded later in life. Now, none of this is to suggest that these benefits of child labor in any way outweigh the negative harms in terms of education. We don't really know that. But the point of all of this research is to basically try to do a couple of things. Number one, use the data to test our initial reactions or instincts about, is child labor good or bad? Well, what does the data tell us? And with enough of these kinds of studies, we can begin to build up a broader picture of what is the impact of child labor. And then it begins to help us think about what should the appropriate policy response be to the phenomenon of child labor.